How to get better at critical thinking. How many times have you seen a job advertisement calling out that a key attribute of prospective candidates for the advertised role is critical thinking? It's nearly like a copy and paste from all job advertisements. The candidate will be expected to apply critical thinking to their role and change how the business manages risk. Can you remember being taught critical thinking at school? What about college or university? Perhaps you missed that class. Being able to apply critical thinking in the modern day world is more important than ever. Why is it though that more and more young people haven't learned how to think critically? A recent study by Forbes suggests that young people are not being prepared to think critically as they move into the business world. It's not only young people though who are struggling with this. People of all ages are experiencing barriers to being able to think critically. Here we look at what critical thinking is, how you can learn to apply it more in your day-to-day life, and some tips for ensuring that you don't let the habit of critical thinking slip from your life. Ultimately, you learn how to get better at critical thinking. The opinions that are held with passion are always those for which no good ground exists. Indeed, the passion is the measure of the holder's lack of rational conviction. Opinions in politics and religion are almost always held passionately. That's a quote from Bertrand Russell. The history of critical thinking goes back to the American philosopher John Dewey, who in 1910 referred to reflective thinking and defined it as active, persistent, and careful consideration of any belief or supposed form of knowledge in the light of the grounds that support it and the further conclusions to which it tends. The intellectual roots of critical thinking go back even further in history, as far back as Socrates 2,500 years ago. He discovered that people could not defend their claims of knowledge when subjected to a series of probing questions. Socrates maintained that people should not naively accept that those in authority who appeared to know what they were talking about and had a smooth exterior appearance were anything but when probed and questioned sufficiently. Going beneath the surface can uncover confused meanings, inadequate evidence, and self-contradictory beliefs. The same could be said of leadership in some of today's top organizations, where people are promoted on the basis of time served or having the right connections rather than on merit. In the civil service, this is more likely to happen with promotions linked along party lines. It's not that I'm so smart, it's just that I stay with problems longer. That's a famous quote from Albert Einstein. So, what is the modern textbook definition of critical thinking? According to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the definition of critical thinking is contested. If you do a search for critical thinking on YouTube and watch the first 10 videos on critical thinking, they are guaranteed to have one thing in common. They all approach critical thinking from a different perspective and all have different methods of assimilating it into your own way of thinking. Stanford says that this mix of approaches and definitions is essentially different conceptions of the same basic concept, careful thinking directed to a goal. It goes on to say, conceptions differ with respect to the scope of such thinking, the type of goal, the criteria and norms of thinking carefully, and the thinking components on which they focus. Critical thinking was defined by the National Council for Excellence in Critical Thinking in 1987 as the intellectually disciplined process of actively and skillfully conceptualizing, applying, analyzing, synthesizing, and/or evaluating information gathered from or generated by observation, experience, reflection, reasoning, or communication as a guide to belief and action. What are the key skills required to ensure that you think critically? And once you start learning the skills that enable you to think critically, does it mean that all your thinking forevermore will be at this level? The National Council for Critical Thinking believes that the ability to think critically is never universal in any individual. We are all still open to bouts of undisciplined or irrational thought. The quality of your critical thinking is on a scale, and where you are on that scale can depend on how knowledgeable you are given any domain of thinking or with a particular class of questions. You should think of critical thinking and the adoption of improved critical thinking skills as a lifelong process and not just a once-off event or course that you might have taken. So what is the number one critical thinking skill that you need to start with? Improving the quality of your questions is the first step towards a more effective style of critical thinking. Questions can be broadly separated into the following types: open and closed questions, funnel questions, probing questions, leading questions, and rhetorical questions. We learn much about a topic when we start with the big picture, and start with open questions helps achieve this goal. Let's take the example of wanting to know more about COVID-19 and in particular if various vaccines are safe to take. You could start with an open question to your doctor along the lines of what data is available on the efficacy of the vaccine. Another question you could ask is how should I prepare in the days leading up to getting vaccinated? A funnel approach to questioning starts with narrow closed types of questions and then progresses onto more open-ended questions. To be human is to have bias, but to be human does not mean you think critically. Overcoming your inherent biases are a crucial hurdle to overcome if you are to look at problems with true clarity. There are many biases at play when you look at a challenge or problem, and the best way to overcome these is to apply consistent methods to your approach. There are numerous cognitive biases you need to be on the lookout for when you're approaching a new idea or problem. For example, confirmation bias, see the world as you see it, and desirability bias, seeing the world as you'd like to see it. So what type of process should you have in place to counter these biases and to get better at critical thinking in general? Well, as I said, one of the main areas that you need to focus on initially is the type of questions that you ask, and to be aware that the type of questions that you ask initially will be influenced by the knowledge you have in a particular area. So you'll be asking questions that are related to that knowledge. But there's questions outside of your knowledge. There's questions you don't know how to ask because you don't have the knowledge necessary to actually be in a position to ask those questions. So in areas where you don't have the desired knowledge to actually ask the right questions, you need to research an area thoroughly and perhaps bring in other people and get their knowledge to see what type of questions they ask about it. Some key questions that you need to be aware of always when approaching a particular problem is, how do you know? How do you know a particular thing is correct or incorrect? How might your perspective be different from others? And why might that be? And how can you solve this problem? Critical thinking is really about shifting your thinking and how you think from your everyday style of thinking to a different style of thinking. Some have referred to it as getting out of the box, or John Cleese famously has referred to it or linked it to thinking creatively, where you have an open and closed mind. And this is crucial in terms of putting yourself in a frame of mind that allows you to think critically. The main themes I would say that you have to look at and be aware of when you want to think more critically is time. You need to give yourself the time and space to be in a position to actually think, and think about the amount of times where you actually have time and space to sit down and think about a particular problem. You have to be very honest with yourself in terms of setting aside allocated time to think and ponder on a particular question. And then giving yourself time allows you to think about the questions that you have about a particular challenge or issue or topic. If there's areas in your knowledge that are clearly gaps or there's missing pieces, the questions you ask should start to reveal what these gaps are, and should you allow you to start looking at how you can improve your knowledge or bring in other people that have the required knowledge. And breaking out of your boundaries is really about breaking out of your status quo in terms of the mindset that you have. In terms of how to think better critically, They would be the five kind of key areas: giving yourself the time to ask the right questions, to get the right knowledge, and to break out of your everyday boundaries. That's it for this video. I hope you found it interesting. If you'd like to see more videos along how to think and thinking better and cognitive biases, please subscribe to the 5 Minute Brain Hacks channel. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you have any comments or questions around critical thinking, please let me know if they are, or share challenges you've had with critical thinking. That's it for today. Thanks very much.